Poverty is often referred to as the lack of material resources or access to the goods and services that are necessary for an individual or family to participate adequately in contemporary society. People living in poverty often experience inequality and a sense of social exclusion. In this case, inequality refers to people receiving different amounts of resources based on factors such as their gender, race, age, etc., leaving some people with more resources than others. Social exclusion, on the other hand, is defined as a restriction of access to opportunities and a limitation of the capabilities required to capitalise on these opportunities. According to Baum and Davnajak, there are several population groups in Australia that are most likely to live in poverty. These groups include women, single parents, Indigenous Australians, and the unemployed. Today we are going to focus on the marginalised group of Indigenous Australians, especially those under the age of 18.
The content we will be covering is what absolute and relative poverty is, the poverty line, facts, why our group is at a disadvantage, and going into some detail about their education and mental health effects. Also, what individual, structural, and multidimensional poverty is, and how it links to our group of Indigenous Australians under the age of 18.
Indigenous Australians experiencing inequality. In the 2008 census, it has been noted that 2.5% of the population identified as Indigenous Australians. It was also noted that Indigenous Australians are 2 to 3 times more likely to be living in poverty than non-Indigenous Australians. Indigenous Australians have been noted to rate far worse than non-Indigenous Australians in relation to education, employment, health, standard of living, and incidents of family violence. This raises the question of how can we change this so that Indigenous are able to live more equal lives to those that a majority of Australians experience. How future generations of Indigenous Australians are going to survive and thrive in a society where so many of their ancestors experienced poverty. This changes the perspective of Indigenous Australians to specifically Indigenous children experiencing poverty and usually inequality. Child poverty is commonly referred to as social justice issue because it is the decision and choices of others about the distribution of resources within the society and within the child's direct environment that determine whether the child will grow up experiencing poverty or not.
What is absolute poverty and what is relative poverty? Absolute poverty from a universal perspective is perceived as relating to an individual or group's state of health and life expectancy. Absolute poverty is essentially concerned with a lack of one or more basic needs, such as water, food, clothing, or shelter, which, if experienced for a long period of time, could inevitably lead to the decline of an individual's health and, in extreme circumstances, can lead to death. Relative poverty refers to an individual or group lacking the resources required to be able to participate in the lifestyle and consumption patterns that others within the same society are able to. This can be interpreted as an individual or group being forced to live on the margins of society, where they are essentially being excluded from the normal spheres of consumption and activity which together define social participation.
Where our group sits, relative rather than absolute poverty. Indigenous Australians under the age of 18 who are experiencing poverty are perceived to be experiencing relative rather than absolute poverty. This is because most children appear to not be excessively lacking the resources to meet their basic needs. However, they are commonly documented to be experiencing the lack of resources required to be able to participate in the lifestyle and consumption patterns enjoyed by other Australians. For example, a large proportion of Indigenous population live in remote communities where, although they have access to basic resources such as food, water and shelter, they are likely to lack the traditional infrastructure that rural communities perceived as basic necessities, such as medical centres, schools. The concept that Indigenous Australians are experiencing relative poverty raises the issue of inequality that exists within the Australian society.
The median line of poverty. A strategy that many governments implement, including the Australian government, in order to determine the number of people experiencing poverty is through calculating what is known as the poverty line and assessing how many people fall below this line. Poverty line outlines the minimum level of income deemed adequate in a particular country. This line will vary taking into consider individual factors such as marriage status, the number of children. A common poverty line used in Australian reports is known as a 50% median line, which refers to half of the middle income for all households. Where our group sits on the poverty line. As noted in the 2012 Poverty Report, analysis of data from the 2011 Hilda survey found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were more likely to experience poverty than other Australians, with 19.3% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people living below the poverty line compared to 12.4% of other Australians.
What are individual, structural, and multidimensional explanations of poverty? Individual explanations of poverty outline that in fact poverty is in the control of the individual. This explanation reveals that it is aspects such as individuals' choices, motivation, moral character, and responsibility that influence whether they shall be exposed to the experience of poverty. This can be seen as a form of functionalism, where poverty within society is noted as being inevitable, natural, and necessary. This approach suggests that the government should provide minimal assistance to those experiencing poverty, because too much support will lead to the reliance and dependence on the government instead of motivating people to engage in an independent lifestyle.
Structural explanation of poverty view poverty as being out of control of the individuals experiencing it. This explanation suggests that it is a social economic structure and systems embedded within society that determine whether an individual will experience poverty or not. This can be seen as a form of Marxism, where poverty within society is noted as being largely unnatural, problematic, and exaggerated by social economic structures and systems. This approach suggests that the government needs to have a major presence within society in order to moderate social economic structures and systems in order to create a more equal society.
Multidimensional explanations of poverty perceive poverty as being largely influenced by structural explanations, however also account for the notion that poverty is complex and essentially a multidimensional concept. Ruth Lister is a well-known researcher of poverty who argues that poverty is best understood as a function of social, economic and political structures and processes which create and perpetuate an unequal distribution of resources both within and in a global context between societies. Lister discusses that there are multiple dimensions of poverty, which include structural, group/individual, life course, and geographical. Lister generally implies that whilst there exist structural structures that increase the likelihood of a particular individual/group experiencing poverty, these people's actions also play a role in regards to if they will experience poverty or not.
Today we are going to explore two different explanations of poverty for Indigenous Australians under the age of 18. The first explanation refers to the individual's health, specifically their diet. The second explanation we are going to explore focuses on geographical location of the individual in society, i.e. does living in rural, small town or city influence the level of poverty and or inequality Indigenous Australians under the age of 18 experience. The diet of Indigenous Australians under the age of 18 can be perceived as a multidimensional explanation of poverty, where although an individual has some form of choice in relation to what they eat, inevitably it is the structural systems around them that influence what they consume. The life course that this population group is experiencing is noted as being childhood. The outlines that it is unlikely to assume that they would have a job and able to purchase their own food. Therefore, the responsibility of diet will most likely fall on their parents. Considering that a large population of Indigenous Australians appear to live in remote communities, their food consumption options are likely to be limited. This further places constraints on the choices of types of food that they can purchase.
The question here is, does the diet Indigenous children live off influence their level of poverty and inequality? Some examples of the main health problems experienced by the young Aboriginal populations include high rates of low birth weight during infancy, intestinal parasites during the ages of 3 to 8 years old, growth retardation during the ages of 19 to 14, and alcohol and drug abuse during the ages of 15 to 20. These health problems can be linked back to Indigenous children's diet. Low birth weight can be linked to the mother not consuming an adequate diet to nourish the unborn baby. This initially can be seen to put some Indigenous children at a disadvantage early in life, which can carry on to cause detrimental effects to their health and inevitably their job prospects and education in the future.
Geographical location. The question here is, does the location in which Indigenous children live in influence if they will experience poverty and inequality? The geographical location that Indigenous children grow up in can be seen as a structural form of poverty. This is due to poverty being beyond the control of the individual and therefore seen as a reflection of the socio-economic system that the child is exposed to. Location. Indigenous Australian children are disproportionately exposed to a wide range of factors including ongoing grief or loss, discrimination, family issues, housing and health-related concerns, low income and poor education. The Indigenous regions with the highest proportion of Indigenous residents were outside major population centres according to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Census 2006. The geographical remoteness of the area that Aboriginal children live in can have a significant impact upon their experience of life and the future of the individual. The rate of poverty in rural and regional areas is slightly higher than in capital cities. Nearly 1 in 3 people live outside our major cities. Deprivation due to location. Aboriginal children that grow up in remote communities have a variety of issues and factors that can lead to them experiencing inequality. This inequality is often due to the children being deprived of physical environments that include housing, road access, water supplies, and clinical services. These influences contribute to Aboriginal children experiencing high levels of poverty through experiencing a lack of resources that allow them to live a happy and healthy lifestyle, leading to inequality due to both structural forms of poverty. Remote communities may have poorer physical environments, whereas town or fringe communities may be disadvantaged by their social environment, particularly those that are damaging social and physical effects of alcohol, according to Rosham and Gracie. Referring to this table, the results show that Indigenous Australian children between ages 4 and 14 reside in areas of remote and very remote, with almost 80% of children living there. The study commissioned by the COAG and the Australian Social Trends Bureau of Statistics report showed that Indigenous people are still more likely to die young, drop out of school, be incarcerated, are the most impoverished and have high levels of smoking, obesity and diabetes. The report showed that in both remote and urban Indigenous communities, the life expectancy is 17 years lower than the general population.
As shown in the table above, school attendance for Indigenous students compared to non-Indigenous students is quite low. But when you break those figures down and compare them to where the Indigenous students live, shows a daunting picture. 16% of 17-year-old Indigenous who live in a very remote area will attend school, compared to 44% of 17-year-old Indigenous students who live in major cities. Children who live outside the major population centres in Australia should not have to settle for a second-rate education. This table shows unemployment rates for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in 2012 to 2013. It is clear to see that Indigenous people in Australia are experiencing a lot higher rates of unemployment. As outlined by ASCO, there is a strong link between poverty and unemployment. One key reason for this is because those that are unemployed rely on income support payments as their main source of income, which falls below the poverty line. This is a huge issue for Indigenous children because a number of them are born into families of unemployed parents where basic resources are at a minimum level and opportunities are limited. This table shows the total number of people in the Australian population that access income support payments, such as New Start Allowance, Youth Allowance. This table also includes information regarding the number and percent of Australian population that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people who are accessing these payments. This information reveals that although the Indigenous only comprise of roughly 3% of Australian population, in 2014 they represented 8.8% of those currently receiving the New Start Allowance, 12.5% of those currently in receipt of parent payments, sole parent, and 15.9% of people accessing Youth Allowance and other. All of these payments have been shown to fall below the poverty line. This data further outlines the number of Indigenous Australians experiencing poverty, which has a direct effect on their children.
Closing the gap. The Australian Government in 2008 official commitment to addressing Indigenous disadvantage within Australia. This is known as closing the gap. The gap raises the issue of inequality between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians when it comes to health, life expectancy, and other issues. Why is our group in such a disadvantage?
It is interesting to consider that according to the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australian survey, there is a positive association between educational attainment and exit from poverty. This reflects the importance of society, and especially educators, to determine strategies to encourage and support Indigenous engagement and achievement in educational settings. The school attendance level for Indigenous students peaks at the age of 5 with 88%, but after the age of 5, school attendance for Indigenous students starts to slowly decline, with school attendance for 17-year-olds only reaching 36%. Some of the reasons for the gradual decline in participation are locational and monetary disadvantage, household overcrowding, and a curriculum that is not always relevant.
Mental health. Research indicates the relationship between health and poverty is dynamic. Those with poor health are more likely to experience poverty, and those in poverty are more likely to experience poor health. It is evident that Aboriginals are exposed to major health risks, which include grief, the loss caused by colonisation, social economic disadvantage, and discrimination. Another area compared to non-Indigenous Australians is behavioural problems and committing suicide, which comes from less likely statistic that they aren't accustomed to assessing a mental health service. For Aboriginal Australians, mental health is an imperative part of their culture, being an inseparable part of their spiritual, cultural and well-being link. Links to young Indigenous mental health issues strand from 5 factors that affect from family and kinship relations, identity, confronting factors, issues surrounding service access, and issues surrounding how services are implemented. Our position on what we believe is the reason why Indigenous children under the age of 18 are experiencing poverty.
As a collective, we agree that location is a better explanation of why Aboriginal children under the age of 18 are experiencing poverty in comparison to their diet.
This is because the deprivation of basic infrastructure, including education, clinical services and hospitals, leaves these children at a significant disadvantage in comparison to not having a well-structured diet.
Diet is not a huge issue for this population group, considering they draw on historical practices of traditional hunting, searching for adequate flow to eat, and creating water wells within rocks.